So, welcome to this little webinar on movement loading and role that load plays in rehabilitation and training in general, actually. And I just thought I'd put together a little webinar rather than a blog this time, just for a little bit of variety. Yeah, just thought I'd do it a little differently. So, I've entitled this blog, Get a Load of This. And one of the things I'm thinking about is, are we often really polarized in the load debate? Now, this is something I've been hugely guilty of myself, and we all are guilty of the fact that often we tend to kind of polarize ourselves according to our biases. And one of the things that I've definitely done over the last year to 6 months is kind of pull myself back a little bit. And, you know, I really start to see the benefit in the evidence and the research to do with loading, you know. And I also feel there's a lot of evidence and benefit in more movement and movement variety as well. So it's important that we kind of take both into consideration and are able to use both in what we do. And that may be capacity for movement, it may be capacity for load and load generation and toleration, and it may also be the convergence of the two within a specific as well. So that's really important. So are we too polarized? And that's my little polarized picture, my flash little bit of PowerPoint technology. That's about as far as it goes, I'm afraid, though. So I've skipped one, my apologies. So here we're kind of looking at the two ends of the spectrum, if you like. So at one end we have variation and skill, which I think hugely important, and possibly one of the reasons I've gravitated towards variation and skill and kind of, getting on my soapbox and pontificating about it is simply because we seem to be a little bit more dominated by mass and strength in rehab and training. Doesn't mean that that isn't important. It just means that it's a bit like the pain debate. You know, people don't really listen unless people shout loud enough, and unless you polarize, it's very possible that you just get there. People don't really take it on board at all. So here we've got kind of variation and skill. In the middle we've got specific skill and load, and over the other end we have mass. So kind of the two circles are meant to represent capacity. So we need a really good capacity for strength, and that the far end would probably be your kind of absolute strength. And then at the far end of movement would probably be, kind of really amazing movement skills, being able to do anything volitionally that someone was to ask you to do. I mean, at both ends of the spectrum with people in pain, we may see kind of deficits. We often see a decrease in movement skill and variety, and we might see a decrease in strength as well. The system wants to create a much more what would be a good way to describe it? The system wants to create a kind of zone that it's happy to be in, that doesn't really stress the tissue in terms of force production or maybe force toleration. And also it wants to have this kind of safe zone of movement that it feels happy to move in, so we're not creating too much tension or compression or kind of parallel shear forces on the tissue. So it's important that we have capacity in both. And so at one end would be a capacity for any movement, and being able to do a kind of fancy movement skills, gymnastics and things like that. Parkour would fit kind of really amazingly at that kind of really far end of movement. But also for that you would need a great deal of kind of strength as well. So it's important that we have kind of capacity in movement and in strength, so that we're able to vary loads across the system. We're able to, assume all the positions that we want to assume for skill reasons, for performance reasons. And then at the other end, we'd like a really great capacity for not only load generation, but also load toleration. Now, in the middle is where we kind of get into this zone where it all becomes very relevant in say, a sports situation or kind of any situation that you may need a very specific part of that capacity to perform a movement in sport. And you may also need a very relevant level of strength or type of strength. So they kind of converge in the middle. And often, that very far end of each spectrum may not be so relevant. It may be range of movement in most sports isn't relevant that often. Running, we may not have a huge range of movement. We may have quite medium ranges of movement. We find that in sports, you often stay within quite a small range of movement. And the same might be true of strength, that you might only use your absolute strength at or need to tolerate an absolute force not that often, and in the middle we get this convergence. So to converge in the middle, I think we probably need quite a lot of capacity at both ends. So it's very, very important that we can look at capacity and increase movement capacity, and it might be very, very important that we also have a capacity for strength and kind of load toleration. And then sometimes we may actually need to look at a specific movement with a specific element of strength and load. So we have this kind of three things going on. And I think we need to take consideration of all of those different things. I think that would be really, really important to do, to take consideration of all of those different things and look at different biomotor qualities, not just get polarized and say, well, you need functional movement, or not just get polarized and say you need to strengthen. We need both, and then we actually need that within a relevant situation. So if you have a sports person, that relevant situation may become very, very important. Whereas if you possibly have someone who's not involved in sport, maybe a general capacity may become more important. I don't know, that would be down to your personal reasoning. But that's kind of my thought process, that we have three different situations, all really, really relevant. One more based around the specific convergence of movement and strength, and also, the kind of the other two based more around the capacity. But almost they're equally important. You just need to be able to apply different things at different times. And the problem with polarization is we have a go-to and we do these things, and and that's to the detriment or to the ignoring the other ones when we probably need them. So it's important that we can have a look at all these different factors and all these different things. Again, that's kind of exercise and movement reasoning, rather than just saying you need to strengthen, or rather than just saying you need to move in different ways. It's actually understanding the convergence of all these different biomotor qualities and the relevance as well. So what we need to look at here is kind of different aspects that they're going to give us. So when we look at variation and skill, we're thinking about freedom and relaxation in movement. If we think about the lower back, it's very important to be able to have freedom and relaxation and kind of unrestricted movement wherever we want to go. I would say similarly that might be true of the shoulder, that we need kind of an ability for freedom and relaxation to go through the kind of wide range of different kinematic positions that we have in the shoulder joint. We don't want it to be constrained. We do want to have constraints to movement because we don't just want it to be completely random. We do need elements of control. Too much noise is a problem within motor control. But equally, we know that after pain, movement often becomes more constrained. So if we're looking at variation and skill, it'd be about the increase of that kind of variability. So varied positions, variation in skill often adds a graded exposure. If you have someone who has a painful joint, working on movement skill and control and variation in itself is a graded exposure, because you're often going to do that without load, and we're thinking about skill. And if you think about if you've ever done any kind of Feldenkrais, or if you ever looked at somatics or Bobath or anything like that, people's ability to have that basic movement vocabulary is really important. So working on that basic movement vocabulary in itself is a graded exposure, but is also going to increase the variety of movement and control that you can have to then move on and load that. But it's also important that we see in that kind of area non-aggravating load. So non-aggravating load might be increasing basic movement vocabulary by increasing load a little bit, like a 2 or 3 kilo dumbbell or some kind of tubing. And often that changes the whole way that someone can move. We're adding in a different movement strategy, we're adding in different loads, we're adding in different motor units and thresholds and stuff like that people may need to deal with. But almost importantly, we do need to think about load in this section as well, because things like isometrics almost are quite important here as well. So kind of this is a bit of a kind of an oxymoron to me, in a way, that the increase in mass, almost, if we think about a continuum of loading, might need to come in a non-aggravating load, and that's because often isometrics are non-aggravating in load. It's a good way to load a tissue without aggravating it by movement. So I probably explained that really, really badly, but kind of in this level of graded exposure, quite a high load might be a non-aggravating load, whereas a movement load would be more about skill, because what we're trying to do is grade that exposure to these different movement positions. And again, we're going to talk about why that may not be true in specific pathologies later, when we're starting to think about things like tendons. It might be that we don't start off with variation skill, we do start off with mass and load. And when we're thinking about specific skill and load, we're thinking about the convergence of a specific skill and a load, and combining elements of those two ends of capacity that I talked about before. And here we may work within what we might describe as a movement ideal. So a movement ideal may be kind of a generalized position. If you went to see a golf coach, he might give you an idealized version of a swing. It doesn't mean that we have to be totally constrained by that, but I think we can have an ideal, a picture of what we might want to achieve. And that could be like, what we might see in tennis, or what we might see in golf, or what, that would be an ideal variation of the skill. But that would also have to be in a variable framework as well. And then we can start to load that up. If we're ever coaching people to move differently, almost we are coaching them towards an ideal. And that's not a bad thing. But we have to realise that an ideal isn't an ideal in terms of, if you get the ideal, you're going to be pain-free. It's only kind of a model, maybe a very, very loose model and framework. And then we've got mass, which would be the kind of far end of strength, if you like, and that creates tension, and it's about force production and toleration, and that's really, really important. Tissue toleration is a hugely important thing, and one of the only ways we might be able to recreate some of the forces that act on the body in running without doing aggravating things like hopping and jumping is to create a high amount of mass, and not drive too much of the stretch shorten cycle in certain periods and things like that. So what we have to realise is when we get into a mass situation, we are going to have less variety due to the load. We have specific positions and we have target tissues. It's the safest way to move a heavy weight. So we have to think that's great for capacity, but sometimes it's not good for specificity. And so that's important to have both of those elements so that we can have specificity and, capacity as well. So it's very important maybe we have all of these different things, and it forms part of your exercise reasoning when you apply these different things within a program. So what we're looking here is at the kind of movement loading continuum. So movement is what we're looking at, and the two distinct ends of the continuum tend to be robust and sensitive. And if we think about this in terms of something like a lower back, it might be that we're thinking about, when we look at some of the research, we find that people with lower back pain, they tend to have less different, variation in their postures. They're not so good at motor control. They tend to have quite specific movement strategies, quite stiff and rigid. So that freedom of movement control and skill in that sensitive phase is really, really important to start to, add some of that cortical mapping back in by providing varied proprioceptive input, to start to get some of that proprioception more accurate, to kind of practice the body at doing it. These things for me are all very, very important. And also in a sensitive stage, that might be really cool as well. If we can, help people and guide people, help people feel safe moving into different positions, then then that fits quite well in that sensitive stage of loading. And then we might need to think about adding that into different movement patterns that might be quite important. So we go from, pelvic lumbo hip control into moving that into squats and bending patterns with different movement, with different kind of reaches and things like that. So we're creating, intrinsic movement skill, and we're creating kind of isolated movement skill in the specific areas we know that tend to lack it from looking at some of the great work out there. And then we can transition that into thinking about movement in terms of a little bit more functional, but with variability and variety of different patterns. And inter would be between pattern, intra would be the same movement pattern. So that might be, a squat, and then being able to do that squat in different ways with different reaches, and that might be really powerful. And then the kind of far end, when people have become more robust, we think about increased capacity, and that might be increasing weight, speed, range of movement, how long they can do it for, dealing with more unstable kind of less assumed patterns, if that makes sense. So increased load would come right at that kind of far end, picking up a heavy box in a position that maybe is less mechanically advantageous. These are the kind of things that get people, they're the kind of things that can't be avoided. So therefore we need to build robustness in them, because movement is a very, very subconscious thing. It just happens. So therefore, always thinking about hip hinging just might not happen in reality. It'd be a great study to see how often people could keep that up for. But it's important we go through that process, you know, and I don't see why that may not be the same with something like a shoulder, or even something like an ankle instability or something like that, or, you know, an ankle inversion sprain or whatever, that the same process would be true. What we have to remember, and my caveat is that that may not be true with specific pathologies, and I'm going to come back to that in a little while. So all those tendon people screaming, you know, that might not work in tendons, that's absolutely true, it might not. So I'm going to come back to that and explain, you know, how we might start to integrate strength and movement and load in a more specific pathology situation. And again, that's just good reasoning, well, good rehab reasoning. So what we have to remember is all exercise is movement, but not all movement is exercise. So, you know, as we talked about before, exercise can tend to be quite constrained, contrived, target tissues, very, very specific skills, keeping neutral spines, you know, all these other factors, which is really awesome if you maybe are ramping up load and you're looking to move loads. But when we're thinking about variety of movement, maybe we need much more variation and less constraint. So all exercise is movement, but not all movement is exercise. So we don't always, if we're going to get someone to move, it doesn't have to be within the constraints of an exercise that, you know, you can put on a sheet or has been done before. It doesn't have to have a name like a Romanian deadlift or a Turkish get-up. You know, these things can be far more variable. Movement in itself is the most variable thing in the human body, I suspect. That, you know, there's so many joints acting with so many degrees of freedom that it's very, very important that we can start to understand and consider that movement is a highly variable thing that we probably need to, you know, always need to constrain, but maybe we do need to constrain if we're looking for more of an ideal, or, you know, parameters like a landing or a cutting, or if we're starting to add in mass and load. And that's why, again, we need that kind of continuum approach. So if we're thinking about how we move that on, we might think about movement variety into movement variety and load, and then load and variety of loads, you know. So variety of loads, you know, might be very, very important to look at. Reactive strengths, absolute strengths, eccentric strengths, that kind of thing. You know, so that would be often be my process, to introduce in a more sensitive stage movement variety, start to add some light loads to that movement variety within the toleration of the tissue, and then start to think about how we can actually load that up again within the toleration of the tissue and get into those kind of stretch, shorten cycle stuff that maybe be a little bit more threatening for those kind of sensitized mechanical receptors, if you like. We know that nociceptors are polymodal, they become sensitized, they sense chemo, they sense thermo, they sense mechano. So we're going to try and avoid that kind of situation too early in the piece while they're trying to calm down and they're a little less sensitized and they're a little less turned on. But we also have to think about limited movement variety and how that, you know, stress equals force times area. So if we have more force over a smaller area, we increase stress on the you know, the system. So it's important that we can increase, you know, the movement skill and what the body goes through sometimes. I think that the more variable your movement, that's naturally the way that the body offsets that element of stress. And we know that, again, pain affects that variety. You know, if we look at great sports people, if we look at experts generally in movement, in terms of a specific skill, and even this is true of, say, deadlifting. Novice deadlifters versus experienced deadlifters show different levels of variety or variation. So experienced movers tend to have far more variation and variety in their movement than novices, and it comes down to that kind of U shape where we have a whole bunch of variables that we often have to stabilize before we can then come out the other side of the U, and we can start to kind of utilize those different variables in different ways. So we may have very, very variable ways that we create movement, but my end point of the skill is very, very stable. We see that within golf, that the trunk and the hips tend to be very, very variable in their movement, but the arms tend to be less so, because the arms are controlling the skill, whereas the variation in the trunk and the hips may be to generate force. So we need variation and variability in how we stress our tissues to summate and decelerate force. But on the other end of the spectrum, the arms may constrain the skill so the endpoint remains stable, which could be really, really important. So if we're thinking about movement variety, that has an actual effect on our loads. You know, so we might go from movement variety to movement variety with some load, light loads, and then load and variety of loads as we can tolerate that. Now with a tendon model, that may be completely different, you know, and I am no tendon expert at all. I kind of take my lead from people much cleverer than I am in this situation. But what I wanted to do is think about how we can still integrate mass and movement into that process. So at one end, we might have maximal isometric loads. Again, we're less likely to irritate the tissue through stretch shorten, sensitize mechanoreceptive elements. We might want to reduce compression through less variation. When things are stabilizing a little bit, we might want to think about load variety. So moving into isotonic away from isometric, and then also starting to think about maybe different loading positions. So that might be simply because collagen regenerates along the lines of applied stress. I'm really delving back into my early learning. But, as we know, the body remodels itself according to the demands placed upon it. So we know that an Achilles tendon, for example, needs to go through a lot of frontal plane stresses, and it might need to go through lots of sagittal plane stresses as well. So as we have different positions, we might emphasize different loading to the tissue, and therefore might influence the actual structural regeneration as well. So we're thinking about going from that isometric, reduce compression, loading up the tissue without aggravating through movement, stabilizing symptoms, moving into more of a load variety, isotonic, just more normal muscular contraction, maybe some slightly different positions, and then starting to think about what the Achilles tendon actually has to do functionally. So we're thinking about load type and movement variety. Load type might be hopping, jumping, reactive stuff, rate of force development. These are all things in the research that we see are diminished. So rate of force development, has been shown in a few studies to be diminished after Achilles tendinosis or ankle problems or what have you. So I think load type increases functionality. So we know that load often has an effect on pain. We know that getting the loading rates right in the right situation is less aggravating, and therefore healing can take place, etc. But then we have to start to think about what happens after pain and reincidence. We have to think about, part of the rehab process has to be about returning more to a fully functional situation, which means all the different deficits we may see in the research, we have to start to think about incorporating into what we do in terms of rehabilitation. So we might have a model here that thinks about movement variety moving into loads, where we might have a model here that thinks a little bit more about a specific pathology and how we can kind of flip that round and think about variety at the end, and at the beginning more about the structure and structural and how we might affect the structure in a more positive way, and what maybe affects the structure in a negative way. So the way we do that at Core Kinetic is what we call our 3Ds. Okay, you see the little play on words there, the 3D, yada, blah, yada, yada, yada. And that might be movement drills, just simply volitionally being able to move my own body. We often see that people are very bad at that. Is that protective mechanical responses after pain? Is that habit and just deconditioning and lack of use? Have we got adequate motor control? Is it varied? Does it have variety? We have to also think about the sensory motor system and the accuracy and quality of that, and then also about our movement parts of the brain that obviously variety of movement plays into feed forward and feed back. We have to think about dimensions, how we can start to think about moving a joint, how we can start to think about getting it into more of a stretch shortened situation, maybe without ground reaction forces and too much energy storage and stuff like that, and how we can provide more integrated information in all three planes into that joint, build joint confidence, and then maybe start to think about the demand, how we use the body to control center of mass, quite aggressive lengthening and shortenings. We also need to think about strength and load toleration, and so we have a different process of moving through that whole concept. Again, it's important we kind of start to look at all these different relationships here. And we see that within the Hill curve, where we see that kind of inverse relationship between percentage of maximal force we generate and the velocity, and how they don't quite, they have an inverse relationship. And we have to think about all these different factors along the continuum. Along the curve. Well, it is a continuum. It's a continuum of movement. At one end would be variety, speed, agility, etc. And then at the other end would be that kind of maximal strength, where often we have to decrease speed and variety and that kind of thing. And in the middle, you might have your traditional Olympic lifts, and then your plyometrics, etc. So it's important we can look at all these different factors. And again, that's reasoning during exercise, and maybe S&C are really good at that, and maybe rehab is less so good at that, and maybe there needs to be a convergence of all those different factors a little bit more together. So, just thinking about that kind of strength. Strength isn't just strength. I've done pieces on this before, and strength is my least favourite terminology in the world. Strengthening, sorry, is my least favourite terminology in the world. Because what does that mean? There's so many different types of strength we might get through. With Nordic hamstring stuff, you're looking at eccentric strength. Reactive strength may be, more stretch, short, and hopping, jumping, triple hops. You can look at things like the reactive strength index, where we're looking at load versus power. We may look at absolute strength, which is load toleration and generation on an absolute sense, your maximal. We look at strength endurance, the amount of strength you can create over an extended period of time. And I'd much prefer to be able to create 90% of strength over, say, 3 minutes if I was a boxer, than be able to create 100% of strength over 30 seconds. For me, often a high time of strength endurance, or a high percentage for a high time, is the most important thing, especially in sport. The ability to have a high percentage of absolute that you can keep going over an extended period of time. We might have specific strength, neuromuscular coordination, where we're actually coordinating muscles in specific patterns that creates a kind of summation. And that often happens. A throw, Olympic lifting, all these different things aren't just about our absolute strength. It's about how we coordinate different muscles at the right time. And we're finding out that specific strength, eccentric and concentric, is involved in running and is involved in landing and all these other factors, not just our strength, our absolute strength. And then sometimes strengthening is about reducing strength inhibition, which might be, pain reduces strength inhibition. As we do low-level graded exposure, the body becomes more confident again. We're massaging the nervous system to say, it's okay, don't worry about it, buddy. And we might see existing strength return. It doesn't mean you're strengthening. It means that your graded exposure has had a positive impact. But that doesn't mean you need to do strength exercises to achieve that. It might be that a variety of movement might achieve the same thing. And then we also look at explosive strength, which might be something like a hop for distance, where we're looking at the kind of absolute explosive strength your body might want to generate. And again, we see that diminished after injury. So is that another good marker that we can look at when we're looking at that kind of rehab continuum as well? So I just wanted to give you a quick example here. Just thinking about a single leg squat. Single leg squat, I think, can be done on both ends of the continuum, or kind of moving from sensitive to load, and then also thinking about movement skill. We might have a squat with a toe touch, so we're offsetting unilateral load. We might have a single leg squat with a balance, holding a bar or a TRX or a therapist, and actually now we're on a single leg, but we have some confidence. And then we might think about a single leg squat on its own, and then we might think about a single leg squat with load. Again, it's about a progression rather than an exercise. We might think about a single leg movement in a movement skill sense, so that actually I might want to move through multiple planes. If we understand ACL injuries, we know that they happen on a single leg, the knee moving into multi-planar tension. So we need to be able to control and be exposed to that. So movement skill might be, we could offset the balance element by toe tapping. We could do a touch at one end and not a touch at the other end. We might do a single leg reach moving into a sagittal frontal transverse plane with no touch. We might do that with added speed. We might do that with arms above our head so that we're reducing the role that our glutes play, and exposing possibly what the knee has to do and the ankle has to do in that situation on its own. Equally, I might want to do the opposite, and I might want to enhance how much my body can help me and protect me in those situations. So it's important that we can look at any exercise with an element of load, and how we can grade that load, and also how we can look at skill and how we can grade that skill in terms of balance and maybe in terms of the amount of dimensions that you can move into. So what we have here, oh, that's gone very badly. See, there's a bit of PowerPoint mess up. I thought I was good at this, but obviously I'm not. What we have at Core Kinetic is simply our 3-pot system, and this is actually comes from more of our training side of stuff, because we also do stuff for PTs and strength and conditioning guides. And the 3-pot system was aimed at a kind of a system whereby we can actually get into thinking about how we can have different exercises with different aims within the same kind of training program, which is really important, because often we break it up into these sections that maybe don't reflect what people need to do on a daily basis. Often skill and load and and movement often come concurrently, especially within sport. So if you think about the 3-pot system, we might have a single leg squat, which encourages unilateral load. We could move that through different dimensions. We might have a multi-dimensional load, which is about moving center of mass into different things, creating more range of movement, deceleration and acceleration. And then we might think about how we can bias more load by adding in something like a loaded squat. So we have like a kind of circuit format, but each exercise with a distinct skill that someone has to adapt to. And often this is quite a good way of, building up maybe to giving someone 3 exercises they can go away and do, and we know we're going to have some really cool different aims. We can have something that's about unilateral load. We can have something that might be about more movement, skill, balance, something that's a bit more about acceleration, deceleration, moving center of mass into larger ranges. And then we can think about biasing much more that load to the tissue. What we know, I think, is that less exercises are more. So often within a rehab process, what I might do is start to create a situation whereby I build up to giving someone 3 exercises they can go away and do. Week 1 would give 1, week 2 would give another, week 3 would give another. Or that may be spaced out however you feel someone's tolerating something. But it's important that we look at those 3 distinct kind of exercises that give us very, very different skills. So rather than having 3 exercises that are out of a gym manual that all have the same element of tissue load, we're starting to think about movements with different skills that create far greater kind of variation of demand on the system, which can only lead to better adaptation for rehabilitation or for performance. Okay, well, I think we've got to the end. I tried to keep it reasonably short. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that made some sense about kind of what we're trying to do and where we're trying to go. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about what we do, then click on around the website and have a little look and that kind of stuff. I hope that made some sense. We're just seeing things much, much more as a collection of variables that we can manipulate rather than, recipes or do this or do that. But also we do need to take into account the functional state of the individual and the pathology that they have, and sometimes the fact that there isn't always a pathology, and we can create change within that. But yeah, get a load of that.